In 2002, 2 days after Halloween, a police officer stepped out of a house in the small town of Navasota, Texas. He shielded his eyes from the early morning sunlight, then ducked under the band of yellow tape that surrounded the house. This officer had been working all night and really needed a break. So he went down to the sidewalk and lit a cigarette. And as he smoked, his eyes fell on a muddy ditch that ran alongside the street, and he saw something in the ditch that just seemed out of place. He walked over and crouched down to examine the object, and when he saw what it was, his heart began to race. It was a mask. Now, under normal circumstances, finding a mask 2 days after Halloween wouldn't be that strange. But this was not the kind of mask you would buy at a costume shop, and the officer had found it 25 yards away from the site of a murder. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please clear the Follow Button's browser cache so they lose all their saved passwords, then reset them all to complicated patterns of random numbers and letters. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of November 1st, 2002, a 54-year-old man named Lonnie Turner stood inside the back room of a funeral home, carefully trimming the hair on a dead man's head. Lonnie was the owner and head mortician of the Jones Funeral Home in Navasota, Texas, which is a small town just north of Houston. Lonnie had already drained the blood from the body and filled its veins with embalming fluid. Once he wrapped up the haircut, he dressed the body and then applied makeup, before moving it into its casket for the wake that afternoon. When he was done, Lonnie headed down the hallway and up the steps to his office. The whole time he walked, his feet ached. Lonnie was only 54, but lately, he'd been feeling exhausted from his job, and from all the volunteering he did outside of work. As he reached the sitting area outside his office, he looked at the photos that lined the walls. There were pictures of Lonnie with the town mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Navasota School Board. He was the first African-American member of the Navasota City Council, and just 2 years ago, he'd received the Citizen of the Year award from the Chamber of Commerce. The plaque hung on the wall just outside his office, and every time he looked at it, he felt a swell of pride. But when he went into his office, Lonnie's smile quickly faded. Because his 21-year-old son, Junior, was sitting in Lonnie's chair with his feet up on Lonnie's desk, talking loudly nonstop into his cell phone. Lonnie tried to get his son's attention, but Junior just clearly ignored him. So Lonnie just stood there, arms crossed, giving his son a very stern look. Finally, Junior stopped talking on the phone and turned to face his dad. But instead of saying hello to him, he told his dad that he was about to register for the Texas Mortuary Law Exam, which he had to pass to get his mortician's license. And getting that license was the very first step for Junior to be able to take over the family business, something Lonnie was all too aware of. Now, Lonnie knew part of Junior probably just wanted to get out of his father's shadow. It had to be hard sometimes when your father was one of the most well-known people in town, but as much as Lonnie did want to hand over the funeral business to his son, he wasn't going to do that until he felt certain that his son could actually handle it. Because currently, his son acted really immature basically all the time. And so instead of Lonnie reacting to what his son had just told him about taking this mortuary exam, Lonnie just said, okay, well, there's still work to be done here at the funeral home. And then before Junior could protest, he told him he had to move their latest client's coffin into the chapel for the wake, he needed to order more embalming fluid, and get the company car washed. Then Lonnie threw the car keys to his son, and after Junior grabbed him, he just stood up and stormed out of the office looking totally annoyed. But Lonnie didn't care. He was tired of his son's bad attitude and entitled behavior, and he knew he needed to be tougher on Junior. If he didn't, he felt like Junior's habit of being sort of lazy could land him in serious trouble. Just then, Lonnie heard voices coming from outside of his office. He peeked into the hallway, and he saw his son talking to another young man. It was 19-year-old James White, Lonnie's godson. James had grown up around Lonnie's family, and had always looked at Lonnie like an uncle, and at Junior like an older brother. Now, James worked part-time at the funeral home with both of them. But as Lonnie listened to this conversation that was going on, he realized his son was telling James to do several of the tasks that Lonnie had literally just assigned him. And he'd caught Junior doing this before, paying James extra to do work he wanted to avoid, and taking advantage of the fact that James looked up to him and would basically do whatever he asked. And this made Lonnie furious, because he didn't give Junior tasks just to keep him busy. They were a way of preparing him to take over this business. For Lonnie, this was just further proof that his son was not ready for serious responsibility. Lonnie sighed, but he didn't confront his son or James. He just let them do their work and then told them to leave early. Once they were gone, Lonnie spent the afternoon making preparations for upcoming funerals and speaking to grieving family members. By the time he could finally head home, he was totally exhausted. After locking up the funeral home, Lonnie drove through downtown Navasota towards a small neighborhood at the edge of town. When he pulled up in front of his big 2-story house, it was dark outside. He parked and walked around the house to the back porch. The light was on and the back door was unlocked, just like Lonnie always left it. He went inside and noticed that Junior wasn't home yet. Lonnie assumed he was out with his friends, like usual. So Lonnie just turned on the TV and made himself some dinner. He ate, watched some local news, and then spoke to a client on the phone around 9:15. They talked for a few minutes, and then after that, Lonnie headed to bed. And he was so tired from work that day that he fell asleep pretty much immediately. And he was sleeping soundly when suddenly there was this loud creaking noise that woke him up. Lonnie sat upright in bed, confused, and before his eyes could adjust to the darkness, he heard something else. The sound of breathing. Someone else was in the room with him. A couple hours later, just before midnight, Lonnie's son, Junior, pulled into the driveway outside the house. As always, he walked around to the back porch as well. But when he got there, he noticed the porch light wasn't on, and it typically was. And so he checked the bulb and actually found that it was slightly unscrewed. So he tightened it until the light came back on. After that, he opened the unlocked door and went inside. He headed upstairs to his bedroom, but on the way there, he noticed his father's bedroom door was open. Now, his dad always slept with the door shut, and it wasn't like him to be up this late. So Junior called out and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. So Junior walked closer to the open door and peeked inside. But when he did, he saw his dad was not in bed. Instead, Lonnie was lying on the floor beside the bed, perfectly still. And on the wall above him was a huge, dark red streak of blood. Junior just stared for a moment in shock, and then immediately turned and sprinted to his bedroom. There, he lifted up his mattress, revealing a collection of handguns, and he grabbed one at random. He jammed the gun into the waistband of his pants, and then fled down the stairs. Junior burst through the back door, jumped into his car, and started speeding towards the nearest police station. As he drove, he used his cell phone to call 911. When the dispatcher asked what the emergency was, Junior told them his dad had been shot and killed. When they asked if he had checked for a pulse, he admitted that he hadn't. He said he'd left in a hurry because he was scared whoever had killed his dad might still be in the house. While Junior was speeding to the police station, an officer named Rob Bailey was patrolling the town. It had been a quiet night, that is until his radio crackled, and dispatch told him that a deadly shooting had just been reported at an address on the edge of town, and the shooter might still be inside the building. And Officer Bailey immediately recognized the address, because, like most officers on the Navasota police force, he knew Lonnie and the entire Turner family personally. And so he sped to Lonnie's house, praying that his friend was okay. When he got there, he parked and headed straight to the backyard, because he knew Lonnie always went in through his back door. But while he was rounding the house, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The lights were on downstairs, and he could see someone moving around inside. Now, part of Officer Bailey hoped that this shadowy figure was Lonnie himself, and that despite the report of a deadly shooting here, that Lonnie was somehow okay. But he knew that wasn't likely. More likely was this shadowy figure was the shooter. And so with his hand on his sidearm, Officer Bailey carefully walked to the back porch and knocked on the back door. There was a long moment of silence, then he heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and when Officer Bailey saw who was standing there, he was confused. He recognized the man. But it wasn't Lonnie Turner. It was Lonnie's brother, Lawson, which was very unusual because the officer knew that Lawson lived almost 3 hours away. And as for Lawson, he also looked confused to be seeing a police officer standing at the door. And when Officer Bailey told him that he was actually here responding to a possible shooting, Lawson looked even more bewildered. He said he didn't know anything about a shooting and said he had only arrived a few minutes ago and found the house totally empty. Officer Bailey didn't know what to make of that, but he asked Lawson to please wait outside, and then Officer Bailey went into the house. Bailey went straight to Lonnie's bedroom, and there, just as Junior had described it, he would find Lonnie Turner laying on the ground beside the bed with the wall streaked with blood behind him. Bailey leaned down to check his friend for a pulse, but there wasn't one. Officer Bailey just stood there for a moment, struggling to process the fact that his friend and one of the most respected men in the city was dead, most likely murdered. A moment later, Officer Bailey collected himself and radioed for backup. After that, he remembered that he had a possible suspect waiting outside. Officer Bailey rushed downstairs and out into the backyard. Lawson seemed eager for news about whatever was going on, but Officer Bailey wasn't sure how much he should say. He was a patrol officer, not a homicide investigator, so he was kind of out of his depth. But he still felt like he had to do something. So he asked Lawson what he was doing at his brother's house. Lawson said he was on his way to Houston, and he was planning to spend the night at his brother's house to break up the drive. He said he'd gotten to the house just a few minutes before Officer Bailey did. And when he'd gone inside, he'd called out for Lonnie, but no one had answered. He'd even looked in Lonnie's bedroom and didn't see him. So he figured Lonnie was out dealing with some funeral home business and would be back soon. And listening to this, Officer Bailey literally couldn't believe what Lawson was saying. The walls in Lonnie's bedroom were literally covered in blood, and his brother's body was literally laying on the floor in front of him. It didn't make sense that Lawson could have looked inside that room and not noticed those things. So even though Officer Bailey was not a detective and was not in charge of this case, he wanted to see how Lawson would react to the news of his brother's death. So he just came right out and told him. And when he did, Lawson looked shocked and then totally devastated, and then he broke down sobbing. Officer Bailey watched him, trying to judge if his tears were genuine, but he couldn't tell. But just then, Officer Bailey looked up and saw headlights approaching the house. Detective Travis Higginbotham parked in Lonnie's driveway. Higginbotham worked for the district attorney's office and had been appointed as the lead investigator on this case. He already knew that the murder of a local celebrity would garner plenty of attention, and also the fact that the Texas Rangers, who were the state police, had been called in to help on this case only made it more high profile. And so for Detective Higginbotham, he knew this case could either make his career or break it. Higginbotham got out of his car and met up with Officer Bailey in the backyard, and he was surprised to see another man was sitting outside and crying. Officer Bailey quickly explained the situation, and the detective agreed that Lawson seemed suspicious. But before Higginbotham could even begin to think about that, he needed to go inside and survey the crime scene. He went to Lonnie's bedroom and took note of the trajectory of the blood spatter on the walls. Then he examined Lonnie's body, and the detective found 2 bullet casings from a 9mm pistol nearby. Given the location of the wounds and the fact that there was no gun anywhere in the room, it was fairly obvious this couldn't be a suicide. So Detective Higginbotham started looking around for clues about a possible motive for murder. Nothing in Lonnie's bedroom, or the rest of the house for that matter, had been disturbed. Lonnie's wallet and his watch were out in plain sight, and there was also $7,000 in cash in an unlocked safe. So it didn't seem like the motive for this was robbery. There were also no signs of a break-in, which made sense considering Lonnie kept his back door unlocked. but that also meant whoever killed Lonnie likely knew in advance he did not lock his back door. So it seemed like a working theory was whoever killed Lonnie knew him personally and maybe had some kind of vendetta against him. As he was thinking this over, Detective Higginbotham heard Lonnie's brother, Lawson, still sobbing outside in the yard. And so Higginbotham got up and headed out to question him. Lawson was clearly distraught, and he started by just repeating everything he'd already told Officer Bailey. And like Officer Bailey, Detective Higginbotham found his story to be very suspicious. The idea he looked in his brother's room and didn't notice his brother's body or the blood on the wall just didn't make any sense. So Higginbotham leaned forward and asked Lawson a much more pointed question. Did he own a gun? Without hesitating, Lawson said yes. He actually had it in his car right now. Lawson led Detective Higginbotham to his car and pointed at a pistol that was just sitting out in the back seat. But the detective saw right away the gun was a .32, not a 9mm. So it very likely was not the murder weapon. But Higginbotham did not think that proved Lawson was innocent, so he decided to bring him to the station, not for more questioning, but for a test. Once they were at the police station, Higginbotham had Lawson's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. The idea was to see if he had fired a gun recently, like that evening. But the results came back negative. Lawson did not have gunshot residue on his hands. However, that didn't totally rule out the possibility that he had fired a gun that evening, because Lawson could have fired a gun with gloves on. Or he could have just vigorously washed his hands afterwards. And so because Detective Higginbotham didn't have any other evidence against Lawson, he had to let him go for now. But the detective was not totally disappointed, because he had another person of interest waiting for him right down the hall. In a nearby interview room, a Texas Ranger was already questioning Lonnie's son, Junior. Detective Higginbotham joined their session and began observing Junior's behavior. Unlike Lawson, who'd been devastated by his brother's death, Junior seemed strangely calm. And his story also seemed very suspicious. According to Junior, when he'd seen the blood on his dad's wall, he had immediately assumed that his dad was shot and killed, even though he didn't hear gunshots or see shell casings, and he didn't check to see if his dad still had a pulse. Junior claimed this was all just gut instinct, but Detective Higginbotham thought it sounded more like Junior already knew what had happened before he'd ever stepped foot into his father's room. But again, Junior swore that was not true. He said he'd been terrified that whoever had shot his dad was still in the house, so he grabbed one of his own guns to protect himself, and then to prove his story, Junior pulled a handgun from his belt and placed it on the table. Higginbotham was stunned. Civilians were not supposed to be allowed to bring weapons into police stations. The detective didn't even know how Junior managed to get the gun inside. But regardless, Junior having a gun during his interview definitely did not make him look any less guilty. However, when Detective Higginbotham took a closer look at the weapon, he saw it was not a 9mm. But still, if Junior owned an arsenal of handguns, the detective figured there could be a 9mm in there somewhere. So, just to be safe, Detective Higginbotham also had Junior's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. And this time, the test came back positive, which would typically mean that Junior fired a weapon that night. But once again, the results were inconclusive, because in theory, Junior could have gotten that residue on his hands simply by handling the pistol he brought into the station. Higginbotham was weighing this possibility when he got a call from the team of investigators who were still collecting evidence at the crime scene. They'd just found the cache of guns under Junior's mattress, and one of them was a 9mm pistol. Now, it would have to be tested against the shell casings found at the crime scene, which would take time, but it could be the murder weapon. And when Higginbotham confronted Junior about this, Junior's response shocked the detective, because Junior claimed that that specific 9mm gun had actually disappeared from his collection several weeks ago. He had no idea how it had gotten back under his mattress. To the detective, this excuse sounded ridiculous, but he asked Junior if, when the gun went missing, did you report it missing? And Junior said no. At this point, Junior's story seemed to be getting flimsier and flimsier. But one thing prevented Detective Higginbotham from arresting him on the spot. Junior claimed to have an alibi. He said he had spent most of the night hanging out with his girlfriend. They ate at a restaurant, then headed to her place for a few hours, and then on his way home after the date, he stopped at a car wash. Higginbotham wrote down Junior's girlfriend's name, as well as the name of the car wash, so he could look into the alibi later. In the meantime, he let Junior go, but promised they would speak again soon. The next morning, Detective Higginbotham made several calls to verify Junior's alibi, and pretty much everything Junior had said checked out. He'd definitely been to his girlfriend's house and the car wash, but there were still small gaps in his schedule where he theoretically could have had time to go home and kill his dad. The detective sighed. Junior and Lawson both had such unbelievable stories. He was sure one of them was lying, but he just couldn't tell which one. Just then, the phone on Detective Higginbotham's desk rang. It was the district attorney, and he had big news. A police officer who'd been cataloging evidence at Lonnie's house had gone on a smoke break, and when he did, he found a pair of gloves and a makeshift mask lying in a creek just 25 yards from Lonnie's front door. Detective Higginbotham's eyes went wide. He knew that if Lonnie's killer had worn that mask, it would probably still carry trace amounts of their saliva, which would contain their DNA. Testing the mask for DNA would take time, but it could potentially solve the case. Higginbotham ended the call feeling much more optimistic about the case. He arranged for DNA samples to be collected from Junior and Lawson so he could compare them to the mask. But almost as soon as the detective did that, he received another phone call. And this one sent him in a totally different direction. That call was from a Texas Ranger who said he'd done some digging, and he had discovered a criminal case involving Lonnie from a few months before his death. Apparently, a thief had stolen several blank checks from Lonnie's office, then made them out to himself, forged Lonnie's signature, and stole close to $8,000 from Lonnie's account. Lonnie found out and pressed charges. And because he pressed charges, this meant the police had copies of those fraudulent checks, and those checks had the thief's name written on them. The thief was Lonnie's 19-year-old godson, James White. After speaking to the Texas Ranger, Higginbotham asked around and learned that James White worked part-time at the funeral home. Evidently, Lonnie had forgiven him for the theft, but Detective Higginbotham didn't think that made James trustworthy. In fact, he thought that James could be just as strong of a suspect as Junior and Lawson. James was close to the family, he likely knew that Lonnie kept his back door unlocked, he also might have even known where Junior hid his guns. And so Detective Higginbotham knew he needed to question James immediately. So he made some calls, and before long, he managed to track James down. James seemed very upset about the death of his godfather, but he was very cooperative and answered all of the detective's questions. And he admitted to forging the checks, but vehemently denied any involvement in Lonnie's death. And like Junior, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. James said he had been at a club in a neighboring town with some friends who would all be able to confirm the story. Detective Higginbotham promised to contact them. Then he thought back to the mask that had been found outside of Lonnie's home, and he asked if James would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. And right away, James said yes. Higginbotham collected a DNA sample from James and then headed back to the DA's office. When he got there, he sent James's DNA to be tested alongside the mask, just like Junior's and Lawson's. After that, he went into his office and he found a report on his desk. It was from the ballistics lab. They'd analyzed the shell casings from the crime scene and the 9mm pistol found under Junior's mattress, and they had confirmed what Detective Higginbotham already suspected. Junior's 9mm gun was in fact the murder weapon. Reading this, Detective Higginbotham was ready to arrest Junior right then, but when he asked the district attorney for approval, he said no. The DA said it was too early to make an arrest. With all the attention Lonnie's murder was getting, their case needed to be airtight. So before they made their move, they had to wait for the results of the DNA test on that mask. Detective Higginbotham knew there was always a chance the DNA test results could be inconclusive and get them nothing. So he continued to investigate his main suspects, and he kept an especially close eye on Junior. And in the weeks following his father's death, Junior went on a massive shopping spree with his inheritance. He bought an expensive boat and a luxury car, and he also hired a lawyer, even though he had not been charged with anything. This only made the detective more certain that Junior had to be guilty. And he was about to march into the DA's office and ask for permission to arrest Junior again, but he knew what they'd say. He would need more evidence. But then, 2 months after Lonnie's death, Higginbotham heard from a fellow detective that a different suspect was also behaving erratically. Lonnie's godson, James, had been caught trying to rob a bar, and during the robbery, he hit the owner of the bar with a cash register. Clearly, James was hard up for cash and willing to go to extreme and violent lengths to get it. With this, Detective Higginbotham found himself feeling totally overwhelmed by all the evidence against each of his potential suspects. However, all this evidence was kind of all over the place. He couldn't really put it all together. And so he went into his office, sat down at his desk, and went back over all the information he had about James, Lawson, and Junior. James was a known thief with access to Lonnie's house. He could have easily gotten inside and killed Lonnie during a robbery gone wrong. However, no valuables had been taken from the crime scene, which didn't seem to add up if the motive was burglary. Then there was Lawson. He was literally in the house when police arrived, and his story about looking in his brother's bedroom and not noticing the blood on the wall or the body on the ground was hard to believe. And finally, there was Junior. Junior owned the murder weapon and had gunshot residue on his hands on the night of the murder, and also the fact that he fled the crime scene before verifying that his father was actually dead still just didn't sit right with Detective Higginbotham. And most importantly, Junior stood to benefit the most from his father's death. With Lonnie out of the way, he inherited a significant amount of money and a successful funeral home business. And so Detective Higginbotham was sure he was so close to figuring out who killed Lonnie. And sure enough, just a few days later, the DNA test results from the mask came back. And when Higginbotham saw them, he knew the case was solved. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lonnie Turner on the evening of November 1st, 2002. That night, sometime between 9:15 and 10 p.m., the killer drove into Lonnie's neighborhood with their headlights off. They parked outside of Lonnie's house, then put on their gloves and their mask, a mask they had made earlier by cutting holes in a gym shoe bag. Now, if all went according to their plan, no one would see them tonight. But if somebody did catch a glimpse of them, the killer could not afford to be recognized. And so as an extra safety measure, the killer grabbed a 9mm pistol that they'd brought with them, and then stepped out of the car and hurried towards the back of Lonnie's house. When they got to the porch, they reached up and unscrewed the porch light bulb just enough to break the circuit and kill the light. Then the killer reached for the doorknob, and as expected, it was unlocked. The killer headed inside and went straight for the master bedroom. They knew the thing they'd come here for was inside of that room. They reached the door, turned the knob, and carefully pushed the door open just a crack. The killer peeked inside. He saw Lonnie was lying in bed, snoring. The killer watched Lonnie for several seconds. They knew entering the room was risky, but at this point, they'd come too far to turn back now. So eventually, they pushed the door open further and began to go inside. However, the killer only got 1 foot into the bedroom before the door made a loud creaking sound. The killer froze. They looked over at the bed, and to their horror, Lonnie stopped snoring, sat up suddenly, and looked right over at them. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. The killer had no idea if Lonnie could recognize them with their mask on, but Lonnie looked like he was about to stand up and confront them, so in a panic, the killer raised their gun and fired. Lonnie screamed, and the killer immediately fired again, and Lonnie went limp and then rolled off the bed onto the ground. The killer was so shocked by what they'd done that they didn't even wait to see if Lonnie was dead. Instead, they just turned and ran out of the room, completely forgetting the thing they had come here for. And the killer was almost out the door and out of Lonnie's house when they realized they couldn't just flee the scene while carrying the murder weapon. So they ran back inside, went to another bedroom, lifted up the mattress, and dropped the gun underneath. After that, the killer sprinted out the back door, tore off their gloves and mask, tossed them in a nearby ditch, and then jumped into their car and sped away. In their panic, the killer never considered the fact that they had been breathing through that mask the entire time they were in the house. So they didn't realize that that mask was full of their DNA. And so if investigators got the mask, it would lead them directly to the killer. When Detective Higginbotham saw the DNA test results, he knew the killer was not Lonnie's son, Junior, who owned the murder weapon, and it wasn't Lonnie's brother, Lawson, who was in the house when police showed up. Instead, the killer was James White, Lonnie Turner's 19-year-old godson. James was desperate for money and willing to do just about anything to get it. And he'd been to Lonnie's house countless times, so he knew Lonnie kept the back door unlocked, and he kept a safe full of cash in the master bedroom. He also knew where Junior kept his gun collection. So, James planned a robbery. He bought a pair of gloves and made that makeshift mask, and then 2 weeks before the murder, he stole the 9mm pistol from under Junior's mattress. Not because he wanted to kill Lonnie, but just in case anything went wrong. Finally, on the evening of November 1st, James put his plan into action. But when the bedroom door creaked and it woke Lonnie up, James knew he was caught. So he shot Lonnie in a panic and then ran away without even taking any money, even though Lonnie's safe, which contained $7,000 in cash, was sitting unlocked not far away. Which means James killed his godfather for nothing. James was arrested and quickly confessed to pulling the trigger. He also admitted that he'd convinced his friends to lie about his alibi. However, James insisted that the crime was not actually his idea. He claimed Lonnie's son, Junior, had literally forced him to commit the murder at gunpoint because Junior wanted his inheritance. However, there was no evidence suggesting that actually happened. Ultimately, James White would make a plea deal and received a 20-year sentence. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen Podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 crazy stories about political assassinations and professional hits. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bug Bite, and it's about a reporter who feels a pain in his leg and assumes it's just a bug bite. But the truth was much worse. The second story you'll hear is called Professional Job, and the series of events in this story are so crazy it really should be made into a movie. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Dispatch, and it's about one of Japan's darkest moments caught on live TV. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a nice hot cup of coffee when they wake up, but then proceed to make them an extremely weak cup of coffee with too much milk and way too much Splenda. Okay, let's get into our first story called Bug Bite. In 1978, 49-year-old Georgy Markov, who was originally from Bulgaria, was living in London and working as a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC for short. Georgy had moved to London 6 years earlier, and in the early days of him being in the UK, he would always take a cab or a bus to work. But over the last couple of years, he had taken to walking to work. Not only was it great exercise, but he also just loved the scenery. In particular, he liked on his commute to stop on the Waterloo Bridge, this very famous bridge in London, where from that position he had a beautiful view of the Westminster Palace on one side, and he had the iconic London Eye on the other, which is a very famous Ferris wheel. So on the morning of September 7th of that year, Georgy got up and he left his flat, and he began his typical commute into work. However, by the time he reached the Waterloo Bridge and was getting ready to take in the sights, it had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. And so instead of sightseeing, he just kept on walking as quickly as he could to try to get to his office before he got completely soaked. But by the time he was just on the other side of the Waterloo Bridge and still had quite a distance to cover to get to work, the skies had completely opened up. And so as much as Georgy wanted to walk, because this was something he really enjoyed, he decided it was not worth it. And so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly, and he rushed over to it. There was an awning that the commuters could stand underneath, and so he ran underneath this awning, getting out from under the rain, and then he proceeded to wait for the next bus to take him the rest of the way. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh. And instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything. And then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him, so he really couldn't do it. And so he's standing there puzzled, still grabbing at his leg, wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe someone near him had a pen or a pencil out and they accidentally poked him, or maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him, a spider or a bee or something. He didn't know, but there weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. But before he could spend very much time dwelling on what had caused this, the bus arrived and Georgy turned around, he hopped on board, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building and he had gone through the doors of the BBC, Georgy had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, when the underside of his thigh made contact with his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. It was almost like he had a splinter stuck in the back of his thigh, and by pressing it down on the seat, it was driving that splinter deeper into his leg. And so Georgy stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and he's kind of craning his head to look down at the back of his leg, but, he doesn't see anything there. And so he's standing there wondering what he should do. He's got a really busy day ahead of him, and he's thinking, should I maybe go to the bathroom and see what this is? But then he tells himself, you're overthinking it. This has got to be something minor. I need to get to work. And so he sat back down in his chair, being very careful with his right leg when he placed it down so as not to press too hard on the spot that hurt. And then he just got to work. And over the course of several hours, even though he knew there was kind of a dull, aching pain in the back of his leg, he mostly forgot about it. He was just doing his job. But by the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgy was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain. But at some point, it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single-stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror to use the reflection to look at the back of his leg. And right away, there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. It looked very much like someone must have hit him with a pencil by accident, or maybe it was a bee sting or a spider bite or something, but whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgy's mind. And so he pulls his pants back up, he tucks his shirt back in, he leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk, and then he sits down, and despite this intense pain in his leg, he's convinced himself it's no big deal, and so he just kind of grits his way through the rest of his workday. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgy's wife looked at him and was like, "What's wrong with you?" He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful, and so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off, but she told him, "Georgy, you are sick, there's something wrong, we have to go to the hospital right now." And so at this point, Georgy was miserable, and so he agreed to go. And so the pair, they made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital. They go inside, and a doctor pulled Georgie into an exam room and said, okay, tell me what's going on. Why are you here? And Georgie would explain how in his morning commute, he had stopped at this bus stop and then felt this shooting pain. And then he told the doctor, I'm pretty convinced this is someone who might have accidentally jabbed me with a pen or a pencil, or it's a bug bite, a spider bite. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it's something minor. And so the doctor, he hears this, and he asks Georgie to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look at the site. And so Georgie does. He gets up, he drops his pants, and then as the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgie kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. Even though he does not have a full view of the back of his leg, it's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. And so after a couple of minutes of the doctor looking at the back of his leg, the doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgie, hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this. And so the doctor goes out into the main hall. He comes back with another doctor, and that doctor comes over. He bends down and he looks at the back of Georgie's leg as well. And after the two of them kind of talk to each other and they're looking at the back of his leg, they stand up and they walk around and they're facing Georgie now. And they say, okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile? I know that sounds crazy, but the mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite. So Georgie's like, no, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. We were all just standing there, and then I felt it in my leg. That was it. And so the doctors would tell Georgie that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital and monitor him and, try to run some tests on him and try to make him comfortable. And so that night, Georgie was admitted to the hospital. He was set up in his own hospital room. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day, when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen. It almost looked like a balloon that had been completely filled. It was very red. And Georgie himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. And so it became a big challenge trying to help him because he was effectively fighting them off. By the next day, Georgie's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, the third day, Georgie would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgie's death, his body was sent for an autopsy to try to figure out what had caused that leg pain, because that seemed to be the trigger that ultimately killed him. And sure enough, during the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison. It is more lethal than cyanide, and it has no antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. And so as a result of these factors, ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations. And the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgie for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kaligan, who was exiled to the United States in 1991, he claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. He said what they did is they put this little tiny disc, that metal disc with the ricin inside of it, they put that at the tip of an umbrella, and they made sure the disc itself was fairly sharp. And then the KGB assassin with this umbrella simply followed Georgy on his typical morning commute, and then when he stopped at that bus stop, the assassin jabbed him in the back of the leg and then faded into the crowd. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgy did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. Our next story is called Professional Job. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day, when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband, Mike, about this guy, Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. and as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do, and Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really, really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris. And so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote death to her on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Dispatch.
Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid. What he's talking about can't be serious. And when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school. And instead, his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics. And he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies. And very quickly, Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics. And he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on. And then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm. And then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya, at this point, was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening, because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can, where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it, and he threw the wrapping away, and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 stories that prove that money is the root of all evil. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Loan Shark, and it's about a student who takes drastic measures to pay off debt. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Western Russian Farm Animal, and the plot of this story is so absurd it sounds like badly written fiction. But it's not fiction. It really happened. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the Amazon Music Follow Buttons toilet paper with the kind that doesn't have a good seam on the outside, and so you end up ripping it to pieces just to get it started. Okay, let's get into our first story called Loan Shark. In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, don't do that again, he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft. He pleads guilty and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record. So he kind of goes easy on him. And he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother. And you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family. He was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead because his big plan is with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail. And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, may God have mercy on your soul, and they leave. The next and final story of today's episode is called Western Russian Farm Animal.
At around 9 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, a 31-year-old woman named Corey Richens tucked her 3 young sons into their beds and then headed downstairs to her kitchen inside of her luxurious home in suburban Utah. Once she got down to the kitchen, she yelled out for her husband, whose name was Eric, to come join her in the kitchen. Corey had some big news that she had just learned that day, and now that their kids were all tucked away in their beds and were off to sleep, she and her husband could celebrate this big news and share a drink together. A moment later, Eric walked into the kitchen and Corey grinned at him and handed him his drink and then gestured for them to go upstairs to their bedroom. And so the two of them went upstairs, they sat down on the bed, and then Corey broke the big news. Corey's tiny real estate company had just found out that day that they were very likely going to close on a deal for this gorgeous 20,000 square foot mansion in Utah for $2 million. Now, Corey knew once she bought this property, she could do a couple of renovations to it and then quickly sell it for $3 million, meaning she was about to make a $1 million profit. Corey had been working really hard on her real estate business for years, but this really represented the first big break. She and Eric lived in a very conservative part of Utah where it was kind of expected that someone like Corey would stay home with the kids and be a good housewife, and that would be her life. But Corey didn't really want that. She wanted to have a professional career that was kind of on par with her husband's. Eric ran a very profitable masonry company that allowed the family to take vacations to Mexico and Spain every year, and also to afford their sprawling property at the end of the cul-de-sac. Corey had stayed home when the 3 boys were much younger, but now that they were 5, 7, and 9 years old, they had decided to hire a nanny, which had allowed Corey to finally go out and pursue her professional dreams. And so, totally beaming with pride, Corey sat there on the bed and clinked her husband's glass and went over all the details of this deal and talked about how great their lives were about to become with all this additional income. But fairly quickly, both of them decided they were too tired to stay up and celebrate any longer, especially Eric, who earlier that day had gotten an allergy shot and it had totally knocked him out. He was feeling kind of weak and tired. And so the two of them decided to just go to bed. And so after brushing their teeth and changing, they got into their bed, they turned off the light, and they were about to lay down and go to sleep when they heard their 7-year-old crying in his bedroom. And both parents let out a groan, and then Corey, she stood up, indicating she would handle this because they knew often their 7-year-old would have nightmares and the only way he would go back to sleep was if his mom laid with him. And so Corey, she kissed Eric, and then as Eric rolled over to go to bed, Corey walked out of the room, she went down the hall, went into her son's bedroom, she got under the covers, and then before long, she and her son had fallen asleep. A few hours later, Corey suddenly sat up inside of her son's bed. It was about 3 a.m., and for a second, she couldn't even figure out where she was. The house was silent, it was totally dark, and she was confused, but then she remembered she had gotten up to tend to her son, and so she checked on her son, she saw he was still sleeping, and so she climbed out of the bed, she tucked him back in, she gave him a kiss, and then she left his room, went down the hall, and went back into her bedroom, where she climbed into her bed. Then she saw that Eric had kicked off all the covers, and he was sleeping on his back. And so Corey laid down on the bed and kind of rolled up right against her husband, and she pulled the covers up over both of them, and then she closed her eyes to go to sleep. But right as she did that, she noticed something very strange. Eric's body felt freezing cold. Corey opened her eyes and sat up in bed. She turned over and kind of pushed Eric to see if he would sit up and figure out why he was so cold. But Eric didn't budge, and when she pushed him, he felt really heavy, like dead weight. And so suddenly starting to panic, Corey yelled Eric's name several times, but Eric didn't budge. And so Corey leapt from the bed, she grabbed her phone, and she dialed 911. And when the dispatcher picked up, Corey was so hysterical as she's looking at her husband lying motionless in his bed that she could barely tell the dispatcher what was going on. But finally, she did get it out to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, "Stay calm, the ambulance will be there as soon as we can." And so just moments later, Corey heard the sirens outside, and so she ran downstairs, she flung the door open, and practically cried with relief as the paramedics charged into the house. But when the paramedics got upstairs into the bedroom and they went to go revive Eric, they saw right away it was already too late. Eric was dead. First responders had no idea what killed Eric. He seemed like a really healthy, fit guy who actually just the day before had gone for a casual 8-mile run, and he was also this big outdoorsman, always going on hikes and going on these long hunts. And so the idea that this guy had just suddenly died seemed really suspicious. The police did find a painkiller pill bottle on the bedside table next to Eric's side of the bed, and for a second they thought, well, maybe he overdosed on painkillers. But when they looked at the label on this pill bottle, it was immediately clear that this was a really old pill bottle and almost certainly had been empty for some time. When they asked Corey what she thought might have happened, she was totally in shock. But she did say, I don't know. I have no idea what happened to him. But, the day before, he did get that allergy shot and he had a kind of adverse reaction to it and really wanted to go to bed quite early, which seemed odd. But both Corey and the first responders agreed that it seemed pretty far-fetched that an allergy shot would lead to Eric's death. Suicide was also considered a possibility by first responders, but Eric really didn't have any reason to want to harm himself. He was a very devoted and loving father who adored his sons. He coached all their sports teams and went on all these adventures with them and was always out back kicking a soccer ball around with them. And his business was booming, and he had just learned that night that his wife's business was potentially going to start booming as well. And so ultimately, the police told Corey that we're just going to have to open an investigation and try to figure out what happened, and we'll be in touch. And if you think of anything that might help the investigation, please let us know. And Corey said, of course, I'll tell you, but she really wasn't listening. All she was thinking about was her 3 sons who were still sleeping in their beds and had no idea their dad was now gone. Over the next few weeks, while the family waited for autopsy results, Corey really focused her energy on her 3 boys, who were really hit hard by the loss of their dad. Eric had been such a hands-on father that his absence was enormous in these boys' lives. The 5-year-old kept asking, "Where's Dad and when can I see him again?" The older 2 boys, who did sort of understand that their dad was dead, would also ask questions like, well, can Dad still see us or can Dad still hear us? And these questions broke Corey's heart because she did not have an adequate answer to any of them. And so she tried to find a children's book online and in bookstores that dealt with grief in hopes that that would kind of help her sons deal with what they were going through. But none of the books she got helped at all. And so a few weeks after Eric's death, when still nobody knew anything about how Eric died or what had really happened, Corey decided that she would take a different approach to helping her sons grieve. Instead of trying to read a book that somebody else wrote about how to handle grief, Corey just called her sons around one night and began telling them a story about their dad. And as she told them this kind of made-up story about their dad being this angel that was taking care of them, she began drawing pictures with a crayon and paper of their dad with wings and a halo, and she'd draw the kids down below waving up at their dad, and she would tell the boys that your dad is an angel now, and he's looking down on you, and he can hear you, and he loves you. And this really seemed to work for the boys. It was like for the first time since his passing that the boys kind of connected with the fact that their dad was gone, but they still had this meaningful connection with him. And so very quickly, Corey's stories about their dad and the illustrations that would go with them became a ritual. Every night, Corey would tell these stories and draw these pictures. And so, as the days and weeks went by, with still no word and no closure about what happened to their dad, Corey had a sort of epiphany. These stories Corey told her kids about their dad and how now he was this angel looking out for them, she could see firsthand how powerful it was and how really it was helping her sons cope with this loss. And she thought, why don't we turn our stories and all these illustrations into an actual grief book for kids? That way other families whose children are dealing with loss can read these stories as well and find some comfort. After all, Corey knew firsthand there really weren't any good grief books on the market. And so she knew for those that needed this, this would be huge. On April 13th, So 6 weeks after Eric had died, and several weeks after Corey and her kids had begun officially writing this kid's grief book, Corey was backing out of her driveway when from the other end of the cul-de-sac, she saw a police car coming down the way, and it was the lead detective on Eric's case, Detective Woody. And as the detective came down the road, he was waving to Corey, clearly getting her to stop for a second. And so Corey, she parked her car, she hopped outside and went up to talk to him. And immediately, Detective Woody got out of his car, he walked up to Corey, and with a grave look on his face, he told her that he had some big news for her and it was going to be pretty upsetting, but he knew he had to tell her in person and right away. He told her that the autopsy results were in, and they determined that Eric had not died of natural causes. He had actually died from a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is a very powerful opioid that's often mixed with heroin, and just a little bit of fentanyl can kill someone. And Eric, it would turn out, had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. Corey was totally shocked at this news and told the detective that Eric didn't do drugs. The only drug he did was periodically he would eat a marijuana gummy before bed, but that was it. So this really didn't make any sense. The detective was respectful and kind of nodded his head and said, I totally understand that, but these are the results, and we need to find out where he got fentanyl from, and so we're going to need to search all of the electronic devices in your house to see if we can find communication between your husband and whoever got him the fentanyl. Corey told the detective that of course they could do that, but as she began thinking about all of their devices, she suddenly remembered that Eric's business partner, Cody Wright, had actually taken Eric's laptop very shortly after Eric had passed away. Now, Corey didn't know why Cody had taken the laptop, but Cody had been a thorn in both Corey and Eric's side for several years now. Eric and Cody had been very close friends when they had started their masonry business together about a decade earlier, but they'd had a serious falling out a few years back. The two men had been on this elk hunting trip, and at one point Eric had illegally shot and killed a bull elk, and Cody had actually reported Eric after this hunting trip to the game wardens. And as a result, Eric got in a lot of trouble and was temporarily banned from hunting anywhere in Utah. The two men still managed to continue to work together and build their masonry business, but it was very clear their relationship was totally fractured and would never be repaired. Now, Corey didn't get into all the details of the tensions with Cody, but she did tell Detective Woody that, if you want access to Eric's laptop, you gotta go talk to Cody because he took it for some reason. And also, you really just ought to talk to Cody in general because, maybe he has more to do with what happened to Eric and this whole fentanyl thing than he's letting on. The detective told Corey that he appreciated the information and he appreciated being allowed to go in and collect all the devices, and that he would go talk to Cody and try to retrieve Eric's laptop. And then after that, the detective thanked Corey and said they'd be in touch soon. But after this conversation with Corey, the investigation into Eric's death kind of stalled out. When police did follow up with Cody, they didn't find anything really worth pursuing. And outside of talking to Cody, no new information came in about Eric's death or about, his connection to fentanyl. And so really there was nothing for police to operate on. And so, while the family just kind of waited for more information to come out about whatever happened to Eric, Corey just focused her energy on taking care of her 3 boys and writing this grief book with them. And finally, on March 5th, 2023, so almost exactly a year after Eric has died, and still police have no idea what happened to him, the grief book was finally done, and Corey self-published it on Amazon under the title, Are You With Me? And right away, the book was a total hit with parents of grieving children. And as the 5-star reviews poured in, so too did requests from local media for Corey to be interviewed and talk about this book and why she wrote it and how her kids are doing. Corey had no idea her book would be this successful, and so at first she was really terrified to do any of these interviews. But eventually she decided she would just say yes to all the interviews because she was very proud of what her and her kids had created, and she knew Eric would be proud too. However, what Corey didn't know was there was going to be a massive unintended consequence from publishing this book. Ever since Eric was found dead in 2022, the police in Utah began painstakingly searching all of the electronic devices that the Richens owned and that Cody, Eric's business partner, owned. And basically, they were just looking anywhere for some sign of communication between Eric and whoever had given him the lethal fentanyl dose. And at some point during the search of all these devices, the police found something very unusual. And they knew it very likely had to do with Eric's death. But they didn't really have any evidence to prove that, and so they just had to kind of sit on it and wait to see what happened next. And what happened next was, shortly after Corey published her grief book, it got all this media attention, and in turn, because of this attention, Eric's death, specifically the unsolved nature of his death, also got a lot of media attention. And eventually, several people who kept seeing all this news about Eric's unsolved death reached out to police and said, you know what? He did not overdose on fentanyl. He was murdered, and I'm almost positive I know who did it. And lo and behold, the alleged killer that all these people brought up to the police was the same person that the police in Utah had become suspicious of because of all those unusual things they had found during their search of all of the electronic devices. And so, on May 8th, 2023, not long after getting all these tips about this alleged killer, the police in Utah felt like they finally had enough ammo to go after this person, and they headed out to make an arrest. While we don't know for sure what happened, because again, this story, it's ongoing. This case has not even gone to trial yet. Here is what prosecutors say really happened to Eric Richens on March 3rd, 2022, the night he died. That night, Eric was upstairs when he heard Corey down in the kitchen calling for him, saying to come down and join her. And so he went downstairs, he went into the kitchen, and immediately he saw his wife grinning ear to ear, and she promptly handed him a drink and said, I have big news and we're going to celebrate. And after the two of them went up to their bedroom, Corey told Eric all about this big real estate deal and how their company was about to profit $1 million. And then after that, they clinked their glasses together, said cheers, and took a sip from their cups. The drink that Corey made for both of them was called a Moscow Mule. It's made with ginger beer, vodka, and lime. But when Corey mixed Eric's Moscow Mule, she added one additional ingredient, a lethal dose of fentanyl. It would turn out Corey had been stealing money from Eric's bank accounts, and he had found out. Eric also had discovered that Corey had been taking out these massive loans in their family's name, which Eric was really upset about. In fact, Eric was so upset with Corey that he wanted a divorce and was talking to a divorce lawyer and making sure after the divorce was finalized that Corey could not touch his money. But perhaps sensing that a divorce was imminent and the money faucet would be turned off, Corey simply took out a $2 million policy on Eric and then killed him. And then shortly after that, in order to help her sons deal with the loss of their father, who she killed, she wrote a grief book about it and sold it for a profit. Police say Corey had been working for weeks to figure out the right fentanyl dose to give to her husband. On Valentine's Day that year, Corey had given Eric a poisoned sandwich that had fentanyl in it that she attached a love note to, but it obviously did not kill Eric. He just broke out in hives. So Corey got a stronger dose of fentanyl, she put it in his drink on March 3rd, and this time it worked. The story that Corey told first responders when they arrived to hopefully try to save Eric was that, they had had this celebratory drink, and then they went to bed, and then she had gotten up to see her son, and then, when she came back at 3 a.m., Eric was cold to the touch, and she called 911. But in reality, after she poisoned her husband, and he's laying there still on the bed, slowly dying from this overdose, she just got up and paced around the house for several hours, Googling things like how to destroy electronic evidence and luxury prisons for the rich in America. These searches were, of course, the highly unusual and suspicious things that the police saw when they looked through all those devices during the initial part of the search. But as much as it made them think Corey likely had something to do with this, they didn't have enough to actually arrest her. However, after Corey published her grief book and went on this big tour promoting her grief book, Eric's family, who's watching this happen on TV and listening to the radios, they just couldn't take it. It disgusted them because they secretly believed that Corey had killed Eric over money. They didn't like Corey to begin with, and it just felt like she did this, and now she's profiting on Eric's death. And so family members began reaching out to police in Utah, and they said, "You really need to look into Corey. We think she killed Eric. This whole grief book thing is a joke. She's a killer." Ultimately, it was those calls from Eric's family to the police, combined with Corey's very unusual and suspicious search history and electronic activity on the night that Eric died, that allowed police to arrest her at her home on May 8th, 2023. Corey, who denies any wrongdoing and says she did not kill her husband, is currently charged with aggravated murder, which could lead to the death penalty if she's convicted. She's being held without bail while she awaits trial, and her book, Are You With Me?, is no longer being sold on Amazon.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen Podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Some people will lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead. But today's podcast features two wild stories where those so-called master plans fall apart in the most unexpected ways. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Sign Here, and it's about a seemingly routine trip to the bank that quickly becomes very disturbing. And the second and final story you'll hear is called A Carefully Laid Plan, and it's about an undercover cop who witnesses something in a fast food restaurant that cracks his case wide open. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, on the next very hot day, take the Amazon Music follow button out to a public park, and as soon as they need to use the bathroom, point them in the direction of a porta-john. And then when they go inside of it, immediately wrap it up in saran wrap and push it over. Okay, let's get into our first story called Sign Here. On April 16, 2024, a 42-year-old woman named Erica Nunes and her 68-year-old uncle named Paulo Braga arrived at a bank in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro in a cab. Erica got out of the back seat first and then asked the driver to wait so she could go inside the bank to get a wheelchair for her uncle because recently he had been sick with pneumonia in the hospital. She found one in the lobby and then wheeled it back outside. When she got back to the cab, the driver helped her lift her Uncle Paulo into the wheelchair, and then afterward, Erica thanked the driver, and then she wheeled her uncle up to the bank, and as she got near the door, a bank attendant came out and opened up the door for them to go inside. Erica smiled at the attendant. Her uncle had been living with her for the past 8 months, and so Erica was pretty accustomed to some level of caretaking, But it had gotten a lot harder recently with her uncle being in the hospital with pneumonia, and so Erica was just exhausted. And so little gestures like this were very appreciated. But despite her exhaustion, today was a really good day for Erica. Because her uncle was so appreciative for all the help that he had actually offered to go to this bank with her today and take out a loan for her in his name so she could do some much needed repairs around her house. So Erica and her uncle made their way through the bank towards the front desk and then told the attendant that they needed to see a loan officer. She explained that they had already called ahead and her uncle had been approved for a loan. He was just here now to sign the paperwork. The attendant nodded and then typed a few things on their computer and then came out from behind the desk and led Erica and her uncle to a desk in back to wait for the loan officer. A minute later, when Erica saw the loan officer approaching the desk, she stood up and smiled and was about to say hello, but the loan officer did not smile back. Instead, she just glared at Erica and her uncle in a way that made Erica feel very uncomfortable. And then, instead of shaking their hands, the loan officer just turned around and walked away. Erica looked around in confusion and then sort of sat down awkwardly, feeling worried and also a little annoyed. She turned and watched as this loan officer continued walking away and then stopped next to some employee. She bent down and whispered something in the employee's ear, and Erica watched as this employee's eyes went wide as she heard whatever the loan officer said. And then this loan officer and that employee, they got up and they vanished into a back room of the bank. So now Erica was feeling really weird about all of this. She turned to her uncle and she saw he couldn't even meet her eyes. So she reached out and just began massaging his neck and shoulders. A little while later, the loan officer would come back to the desk, and this time she was carrying this huge stack of papers, and she placed it on the desk in front of Erica's uncle. But instead of sitting down and going over this huge amount of paperwork with them, the loan officer just stood there staring at Erica, and Erica stared right back. And for about 30 seconds, there was just tense silence, and then eventually, the loan officer pulled out her phone and very obviously started filming. And so now, Erica went from feeling just uncomfortable to feeling sort of afraid. I mean, this was definitely not normal bank behavior, even for a seemingly very rude employee. But Erica decided to kind of ignore the weirdness and just get her uncle started on the paperwork. But after a few minutes, Erica began to hear the sound of emergency sirens outside the bank. And when she looked up, she saw all these police and first responders running towards her. The video that loan officer shot that day of Erica and her uncle went viral in Brazil. In this video, Erica is seen smiling and attempting to help her uncle sign this paperwork, and she's obviously holding up her uncle's head. But her uncle is not weak from illness. Her uncle is dead. In fact, he had died hours before Erica had brought him to the bank. Now, Erica later claimed that she had no idea her uncle was dead. However, it was very obvious to everyone around her, which is why all the bank employees were acting so strange. Erica was arrested and held for 16 days before being released on bail. She faces charges of abusing a corpse and attempted theft through fraud. Her case has not yet been adjudicated.
The next and final story of today's episode is called A Carefully Laid Plan.
On the evening of June 17th, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and 2 kids in suburban Texas. It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so, after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out looking out the window. But eventually, she kind of snapped out of it, she gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son, Caleb, hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband, Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other. And next to them was their 1-year-old daughter sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along. And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so, with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so ultimately the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son, because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own, but Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad. And so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related. And so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together. And then afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed. And then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer. And so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard the sound of their front door open and then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on and leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her. And so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that, and so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing, and so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6 a.m., she rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed, she made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there. And so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm, stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car. She jumped inside, she turned it on, she peeled out of the driveway and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side, and she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course, Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son. He's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road, she throws it in park, she gets out and runs to the nearest police officer and begins frantically asking them, "What's happened here? What's happened?" And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him, there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is. And the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, "Do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay?" The officer told her to please calm down. "We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything." But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers. And so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there, she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, both women are totally hysterical, but they run right up to the police tape, and they look down in the direction of where this fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. And immediately, when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car. Or I should say, she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of the vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. And so between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have, along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat, it was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends in Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly in Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay, she still very much appreciated the effort that people were making to comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being, there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle save for the frame, and also Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident, or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from the crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. It would turn out there was lighter fluid found all over the front seat of the car, so that was the reason the fire had gotten so big. And then during the autopsy, Clay's lungs showed that he had not ever inhaled any soot, meaning he was dead when the fire started. And so very likely, Clay was murdered and the car accident was staged. When word started to get out in town that Clay's death seemed suspicious and that maybe he was murdered, it turned out nobody was surprised. Because even though Molly adored Clay and thought he was a great father, most other people in Leander hated him.
He was known around town to be this totally short-tempered guy who would just pick fights with people out of the blue. In fact, at Clay's own funeral, his literal best friend stood up to eulogize him, and during this, he said, "I think honestly, the world is a better place without Clay." And so investigators began looking into Clay's background to see if they could find connections with people that might have a grudge or some reason to be mad at Clay who might want to do him harm. And very quickly, investigators found something. Just 10 days before Clay was found, he had pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. But the sentence he received was incredibly light. He was given 30 days in jail, which he had not served yet, and probation. Now, the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's light sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So investigators quickly tracked down this father, and they brought him in for questioning. But very quickly, this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay. Yes, he had threatened to kill Clay, but no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay. And the father had an alibi to back that up. And so, after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect, but he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also at the same time very, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally, she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve. And so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up, they left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious, and it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to, and Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly non-stop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible, and Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned, after talking to Molly's neighbors, that Molly was starting to date again already, just 3 weeks after her husband has died. She's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her 2 kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old, who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional, and periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy!" But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, really, you should get your son some help here, Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine, it was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him or how he died and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death. And so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work, Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed, and they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then, on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize, with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window. And then at some point, Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her. And then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so the undercover police officer followed after them. And eventually, the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food, and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seeing anything incriminating happening here, but what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious, and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot, and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles, and they casually walked into the Taco Bell, and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with, something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, all right, we're doing something here. The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise, and the officer just stared down at the guy, not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was someone he knew personally from being in law enforcement in the area. This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so that was why there was no skid marks up on the road, because again, this was not a car accident, it was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. They were questioning how he died, but nobody really thought it wasn't Clay. And so their plan was working, but after 3 weeks of being apart with Clay kind of hanging out by himself away from the town, Clay and Molly just couldn't stand to be apart any longer. And so Clay dyed his blonde hair black. That was the only thing he did to disguise his identity. And then he just moved back into the home with Molly and the kids. And so that was the new boyfriend that neighbors were seeing Molly with. She was not actually going out on new dates. She was just back with Clay. And Clay's stepson, Caleb, the 4-year-old, he immediately recognized that his father was back, even though he had black hair. But Molly and Clay had convinced the little boy that Clay was not really Clay. Instead, this was the new boyfriend, Jake. This is very likely why Caleb had begun acting out. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but not old enough to understand that his parents were lying to him. It's unclear why Molly and Clay, who lived together shamelessly, decided to have this weird rendezvous in the parking lot inside of Clay's Mustang and then go to Taco Bell and eat together. But regardless, it was this secret meetup that ultimately led to them getting caught. Molly and Clay were both charged with insurance fraud, and they both pled guilty. Molly was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Clay was sentenced to 30 years in prison plus 20 more years for probation violations. Molly has since been paroled, while Clay is still in jail.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you. On June 8, 1989, in Pikeville, Kentucky, a young woman stood outside on the second-floor balcony of a motel room, smoking a cigarette and staring down anxiously at the parking lot below. A few minutes later, a little Ford Tempo car pulled into the lot, and the driver got out and started walking towards the first floor of the motel. When the woman saw who the driver was, she instantly flicked her cigarette and began charging down the outside stairs 2 at a time to go cut the driver off. Moments later, the young woman and the driver would be inside of that little Ford Tempo car together, speeding down a dark mountain road, screaming at each other about what the heck they were going to do now. What happened that night inside of that little car after the driver had finally pulled over on that dark road would be so rare and so terrible that the FBI would actually report that it literally, in its entire history, had never seen a case like this before. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you visit the Amazon Music follow button's home, bring along a container of German cockroaches and release them into their pantry. Okay, let's get into today's story. In September of 1987, 25-year-old Susan Daniels Smith stood in the corner of the living room inside of a house she rented in a small mountain town near the Kentucky-West Virginia border. People were talking loudly inside of this room, but Susan pretended not to be paying attention to what was going on around her. She lived in the small 4-room house with her 2 young kids and her ex-husband, Kenneth. And sharing a home with her ex-husband was bad enough, but recently, things had gotten a lot worse when he invited 2 of his friends to stay with them. They were a couple, and Susan knew they were dangerous. The man in the couple was known around town as Cat Eyes because he had piercing hazel blue eyes.
And he was a hero to the petty criminals in the area because years ago, he had successfully robbed a bank and gotten away with over $300,000. And rumor had it, Cat Eyes had then gone out and blown all of that money on flashy cars and cocaine. Susan wanted nothing to do with Cat Eyes, and she definitely didn't want this man and his girlfriend anywhere near her kids. But she didn't try to kick them out of the house because she knew that would make her ex-husband Kenneth angry, and when Kenneth got angry, he could get violent. So, Susan stood there in the living room, staring off into space like she was in another world. But the whole time, she was really listening to Cat Eyes brag about his plan for his next big bank robbery. And as Susan listened, she decided Cat Eyes' plan was her ticket out of that small town and into a better life for her and her kids. Susan had spent years dreaming about getting out of the situation she was in. She'd been poor since she was born, and she had lived most of her life in an area of the Appalachian Mountains that was known for hosting an annual event called Hillbilly Days, and for being the home of a legendary feud between two famous families, the Hatfields and the McCoys. And so Susan just felt like everything around her, physically, emotionally, mentally, was trapped in the past. But she wanted a life that was new and modern, like the lives she saw people leading on TV and in movies. And she would spend hours at a time imagining what it would be like to go on an exciting adventure, or to fall in love with the perfect guy and move to a big house in the suburbs with a huge yard for her kids to play in. But Susan knew finding a new life like that would cost money, and she didn't even have enough money to rent a place of her own without her ex-husband. But now, standing in the living room, Susan believed Cat Eyes' next bank robbery could change her life for good. So while Cat Eyes dazzled his girlfriend and Kenneth with his latest plan, Susan slipped out of the living room and into the kitchen. She listened to make sure Cat Eyes was still talking, and then she placed a phone call. And when a man picked up on the other line, Susan spoke in a whisper, said a few words, and then hung up. Then she walked back into the living room and interrupted Cat Eyes to say she was going out for a jog but would not be gone for long, and she told Kenneth to keep an eye on their kids, who were playing in another room. The group in the living room barely looked up at Susan, so she walked to the front door, stepped outside, and headed down the street towards the center of town. Susan was 5 foot 5 inches tall with short brown hair, and she wore cutoff jean shorts and a sleeveless shirt to show off her tan. The weather was warm, and she loved feeling the sun on her face, and even brief moments away from the chaos of her house made her feel like she was free. But as nice as it was outside, she reminded herself that this was not a leisurely walk. And as she thought about what she was on her way to do, she started getting nervous, and she felt like she had a pit in her stomach. Then, when she got to the center of town, Susan turned off from the main road onto a nearby deserted side street, and she saw an old Dodge sedan parked there. Susan glanced back and forth and looked over her shoulder, and when she was sure nobody was watching her, she walked down the street to the Dodge, opened the door, and slid into the passenger seat. Then she turned and said hello to the man sitting in the driver's seat. It was FBI agent Mark Putnam. Mark was only 28 years old, but he looked older in his dark suit and tie. And he had a confidence about him that made him seem like he'd been an FBI agent a lot longer than he actually had. Mark thanked Susan for meeting with him, and then asked what information she had that could help him. Mark had met Susan a month earlier when he had started working in the Pikeville, Kentucky FBI office, which was not far from where Susan lived. Coming to the small Kentucky town had been Mark's first major assignment at the bureau, and at the time, his wife had been shocked that Pikeville even had an FBI office. But Mark knew that region of Kentucky and West Virginia had long been a favorite spot for bank robbers, because the towns in surrounding hill country were dotted with small banks that carried significant amounts of cash, but didn't always have the same level of security that larger banks in bigger cities had. And so Mark had come to Pikeville primarily to crack down on bank robberies. And soon after his arrival, he had focused his attention on Cat Eyes. But to bring Cat Eyes down, Mark needed inside information. So he had reached out to local law enforcement to see if they could help him find a trustworthy informant, someone who would give him the information he needed to catch Cat Eyes in the act. And a sheriff's deputy had introduced Mark to Susan. Susan had dealt drugs in the past, and she had connections to criminals in the area, and most importantly to Mark, Susan knew Cat Eyes. But at first, the idea of becoming an FBI informant had horrified Susan, and she told Mark she would never rat out people she knew to the government, no matter what crime they committed. But then, Mark had explained the FBI would pay her good money if she provided them with useful information. And soon, after meeting Susan, Mark handed her $500 just to prove he was serious. And right then, Susan had realized that becoming an FBI informant was her best chance to start a new life for her and her kids. So, in the Dodge sedan, Susan shifted back and forth in the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and told Mark she was ready to start talking. And so Mark grabbed a pen and a small notebook from his pocket and listened. Then Susan told Mark that Cat Eyes and his girlfriend had been staying at her house, and she said Cat Eyes had been actively talking about the next big bank robbery he was planning. She said he never mentioned the exact bank, but she was sure it was one in the area. Mark said she was probably right, and then he asked her to give as many details as possible. So Susan relayed everything she'd heard Cat Eyes say in her living room. Mark wrote everything down and thanked her for talking to him. He said the information she provided could prove to be very valuable. And he told her if the information turned out to be true, the FBI would pay her $1,500, which by today's standards in 2023 would be worth about $4,000. A huge smile crossed Susan's face. That kind of money could go a long way to helping her and her kids. And she knew if she was right about this bank robbery, the FBI would probably want to keep using her as an informant so she could keep earning money by talking. Then Mark reminded Susan to just act normal when she got back home and to not talk about the bank robbery at all. Susan said she understood, then she looked around to make sure nobody was close by, and she stepped back out of the car. Once she was outside, she put her head down and walked as fast as she could back to her house. When she got home, everybody, Cat Eyes included, was still talking in the living room, and they barely even noticed she'd been gone. Susan let out a sigh of relief and went to check on her kids in the other room. And she told herself she just had to play it cool for a few days and then everything would be fine. And then on September 10th, just a couple of days after Susan had met with Mark, Cat Eyes robbed a bank in Pikeville, Kentucky and got away with thousands of dollars. But because of Susan's information, the FBI had been prepared. And so banks throughout the area had used dye packets to stain the cash in their vaults. And so a week later, when Cat Eyes tried to exchange the dye-stained bills he'd stolen for clean bills at another bank, the bank teller immediately called the FBI on Cat Eyes, and the FBI tracked him down. The information Susan had provided Mark had led directly to Cat Eyes' arrest, and so Susan got her $1,500 and proved she was an informant the FBI could trust. And for the first time, Susan started to believe she really could change her life, and that her dreams of having a big house and a safe, quiet neighborhood were about to come true. In the months following Cat Eyes' arrest, Susan kept in contact with FBI agent Mark Putnam, and the FBI believed that because Susan had dealt drugs in the past, she might be able to help them with drug trafficking cases that reached as far west as Chicago. Susan was excited at the prospect of helping them with these cases, and she felt like working as an informant for the FBI was the closest thing to being a character in an action movie she could possibly imagine. But then, in early 1988, about 4 months after Cat Eyes got caught, Mark told Susan the FBI needed her to testify against Cat Eyes in court. But the thought of appearing in court terrified Susan. She said secretly passing along information to the FBI was one thing, but testifying out in public was too much. She was afraid if she helped send Cat Eyes to prison publicly, well, his friends and family might try to take revenge on her. But Mark said if she agreed to testify, the FBI would pay her $4,000, which by today's standards in 2023 would be over $10,000. And that was just too much money for Susan to turn down. So about a month later, she took the stand in court and testified against Cat Eyes. And it turned out that Susan was a very strong witness for the government, and her testimony really helped put him behind bars. And after the court case, Susan continued to work as an FBI informant, and she even gave them information that helped them bust Cat Eyes' uncle for another bank robbery. Susan was really excited that the FBI believed in her and that she had even more money coming in, but people around Susan were starting to catch on to her new job. Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, knew she had testified against his friend Cat Eyes, and now he suspected Susan was still working as a government rat, and he said he was disgusted that she would sell out people she knew to a bunch of FBI agents, and so he grew increasingly angry and violent towards her. And Susan was afraid of Kenneth, and she was scared that having testified in court had now put her in danger just like she said it would. And so by the fall of 1988, about a year after Cat Eyes was arrested, Susan was living in almost constant fear that someone was going to kill her. And to deal with that fear and paranoia and stress, she had started drinking heavily and doing cocaine. Then, on a night in May of 1989, over a year after she had testified against Cat Eyes, Susan was throwing back a few drinks at a local bar. The music was loud, Susan was laughing with her friends, and she could hear the sound of pool balls crashing against each other from the pool tables at the back of the bar. And at least for a few minutes, Susan forgot about all the problems in her life. When she was done drinking, she paid her bill, and she and her friends stumbled outside into the night air. But as she walked down the street, Susan heard someone shout her name from behind her. She stopped, lurched forward on her feet a little, and then turned around. Her balance was off and her vision was fuzzy from the alcohol, but she saw the woman who had called her name. It was Cat Eyes' girlfriend, the same one who had been at Susan's house for a time. And before Susan could do anything, the woman was running right at her. Cat Eyes' girlfriend screamed, lunged at Susan, and slammed her to the ground. Then she got on top of Susan and began pounding on her with her fist. Susan tried to get the woman off of her, but she couldn't, and then she felt a sharp pain in her back from where she'd fallen on the hard concrete, and her head throbbed with every hit she took. Finally, Susan's friends who saw this happening ran over and managed to break up the fight, but Susan just stayed on the ground, trying not to show how upset and scared she was. Cat Eyes' girlfriend started to walk off, but she stopped, turned around, and told Susan she would find her again soon, and next time she would kill her. In the days following the fight with Cat Eyes' girlfriend, Susan's fear and paranoia got much worse. Every time she left her house, she was convinced she was being followed, and at home, she got jumpy whenever the phone rang, so she didn't feel safe anywhere. And she knew she couldn't keep living like that, so she turned to the FBI for help. But Agent Mark Putnam, who Susan had trusted and worked closely with, had transferred months earlier to the FBI branch in Miami, Florida. But during his time working with Susan, Mark had introduced her to another agent who he trusted, and Susan had worked with that agent as an informant as well. So Susan called that FBI agent and told him about everything that was happening in her life. The agent was concerned and he wanted to help, so he booked her a room at a motel in Pikeville, not far from the FBI offices. Susan was worried about being away from her kids for too long, but despite the ongoing huge issues she was having with her ex-husband Kenneth, he had moved into his own place and had been taking care of the kids far more often since Susan's life had started falling apart. So Susan felt like even if she went away for a little while, the kids would be looked after. And so Susan accepted the offer from the FBI agent and went to stay at the motel. A few days later, at 10:30 p.m. on June 8, 1989, Susan was standing outside her second-floor motel room smoking a cigarette. She wore gray gym shorts and a t-shirt. With the moon glowing bright in the sky, Susan stared at the outline of mountain peaks on the horizon. The view was beautiful, but it made Susan sad, because not that long ago, she had believed she was finally going to move somewhere else new with her kids to start a better life. But now, at only 27 years old, things seemed like they just kept getting worse for her, and Susan was losing hope that she would ever escape this place. Just then, Susan heard a car pull into the parking lot down below. She leaned over the second-floor railing to get a better look, and she saw the car was a Ford Tempo, and immediately she felt her pulse quicken because she recognized that car. Susan stepped back from the railing but kept an eye on the parking lot. Then she saw the driver step out and go into a room on the first floor. Susan stood there for a minute trying to decide what to do. But then she flicked her cigarette to the ground and rushed down the outside stairwell towards the front door of the room the driver had just gone into. When she got to that room, Susan started banging on the door. The door eventually opened, and immediately Susan just rushed past the driver inside. And as soon as Susan was inside, the driver slammed the door in frustration behind her. Then, just a few minutes later, the door opened again, and the driver and Susan rushed through the parking lot together, and they both got into the Ford Tempo car. Then the driver started the engine, hit the gas, sped away from the motel, and they turned onto a dark mountain road. On the morning of June 16, 1989, 8 days after Susan and the driver of the Ford Tempo had left the motel, Detective Richard Ray of the Kentucky State Police sat down at his desk in the state police offices in Pikeville. Ray was 54 years old, and he had recently started thinking about retirement. He was the most experienced detective working out of the Pikeville office, and he'd started to get tired of all the bureaucracy he felt like he was always running up against in the department. But Ray didn't let his thoughts of retirement keep him from doing his job. And his bosses knew that whenever there was a particularly tough case in the area, Ray was the man they wanted leading the investigation. Ray took a sip of coffee and saw a handwritten note addressed to him on his desk. He picked up the note and quickly read it over. The note was a request from his boss for Ray to look into a new missing persons case. So Ray took another sip of coffee, put his mug down, and walked across the station to talk to the officer who'd taken the missing persons call. And the officer told Ray the missing person in question was a woman named Susan Daniel Smith, and that her sister had called in after not seeing or hearing from Susan for several days. Ray nodded and said he'd get right on it. He had worked in the area long enough to know who Susan was, and that she had been working as an FBI informant, and Detective Ray also knew that that meant she could be in real danger. So he headed out of the office and drove to the nearby town where Susan's sister lived. And when Ray arrived at her house, Susan's sister let him inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Detective Ray was a man of few words, but when he did speak, he had a warm, reassuring voice. And he told Susan's sister he was going to do everything he could to help. And she told Ray that Susan had mentioned she was going to stay at a motel in Pikeville for a few days, and that after that she might go to Chicago with some friends. When Ray heard this, his first thought was that Susan might have actually gone out of town just to help the FBI with something. But he kept that to himself, and he asked if it was possible Susan had just extended her trip for a few days. But Susan's sister said that Susan would never do something like that without calling, or at least without checking in on her kids. And Susan's sister knew that Susan's kids had not heard from their mom in over a week. Ray said it was good that she had called it in, and then a serious look came across his face, and his voice got even quieter. And he asked Susan's sister if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Susan. And without missing a beat, she said Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, was a violent man. Detective Ray thanked Susan's sister for her time and said he would keep her informed when he learned more. Then Ray walked back through the house, stepped outside, and got into his car. Ray knew Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, had dealt drugs in the area for years, and that he was a friend of Cat Eyes, the bank robber Susan had helped put away. But before Ray could track down Kenneth, he knew he had to check in with the FBI. The missing person was one of their informants, and he had to make sure his investigation was not going to interfere with something they were working on with Susan. So, later that day, when Ray got back to the station, he reached out to the FBI. The relationship between the FBI and the state police in Pikeville was not always the best. FBI agents, especially young ones, often clashed with state troopers when working cases together, and there seemed to be a level of distrust from both sides. But Detective Ray had worked closely with several FBI agents in the area, and he knew they were committed to their jobs just like he was. And even if he didn't always see eye to eye with them, he knew they generally shared the same goal as him, to keep the people in the area safe. So, Ray spoke to the FBI agent who had recently begun working with Susan, and when the agent heard Susan was missing, he got very concerned. He told Ray that she had been given a room at a local motel, but it was his understanding that she had left town and gone to Chicago. Ray and the agent talked a little bit longer, and then they agreed to keep in touch and let the other one know if they discovered anything new. And so after touching base with the FBI, Ray contacted Susan's friends and family to see if any of them had information that could help him. And after talking to Susan's friends, it didn't take long for Ray to start hearing more about Kenneth, her ex-husband, as well as a few other people around town who apparently had a personal grudge against Susan. In the following weeks, Detective Ray thought he had at least 2 legitimate suspects who he believed could have something to do with Susan's disappearance, her ex-husband, Kenneth, and Cat Eyes' girlfriend. But while trying to pursue those leads, Ray suddenly ran into a lot of the issues at his job that had started to frustrate him and make him think about retiring. Ray discovered that as far as state police leadership and the FBI were concerned, Ray had no proof that any crime had actually been committed. Susan's body had not been found, and there was no evidence that any violence had taken place at the motel where she had been staying, or at the homes of her ex-husband, her sister, or any of her friends. And so as Ray tried to argue his case for bringing in suspects for questioning, he was continually told that the missing person, Susan Daniel Smith, had a history of using and dealing drugs, and that there was a good chance that she had just left town to deal or use drugs in a place where she wasn't so well known. Ray felt like he'd run up against a bureaucratic brick wall, and that his investigation was stalling before it really even got started. And his job only got harder when he was quickly assigned to other cases, and anything involving Susan got put on the back burner. But as he moved on to these other cases, Ray refused to put Susan's case completely aside, and he made time, even if it was just for a few hours a week, to keep his search for Susan going. Because he believed that even if this young woman had made some questionable choices in her life, she still deserved to be found and protected. And so for months, Susan remained missing, and Ray continued to put pressure on his superiors to let him pursue the people he believed could be responsible for Susan's disappearance. And finally, in January of 1990, 7 months after Susan was last seen, Ray was allowed to bring Susan's ex-husband, Kenneth, in for questioning and a polygraph, or what some people call a lie detector test. On a cool winter day, months into the investigation, Ray led Kenneth into a small interrogation room at the State Police Department in Pikeville, and they sat down across from each other at a table. Kenneth was tall and handsome with long brown hair, and he wore jeans, a t-shirt, and cowboy boots that he tapped on the floor while he talked. Since Susan's disappearance, Kenneth had been taking care of their kids on his own, and he told Ray that he was trying really hard to clean up his act and become a better father. He said he'd gotten a job and that he'd kicked using drugs of any kind. But despite Kenneth's claims, his hands were jittery, and he was talking so fast that Ray wondered if the man was high right there in the interrogation room. But then, Detective Ray asked Kenneth if he knew where Susan was, and Ray's sense of calm seemed to immediately rub off on Kenneth, and so Kenneth, he took a breath, and then clearly laid out a timeline of when he had last seen and spoken to his ex-wife. He said Susan had stayed with him and the kids at his new place for a night back in June, right before she was planning to leave town, but then she never called or showed up again. Detective Ray nodded, and then he asked Kenneth about past arguments and physical altercations he had had with Susan. And Kenneth said he knew he had been a terrible husband and a terrible father in the past, but as Kenneth leaned across the table and looked right at Detective Ray, he said he had nothing to do with Susan going missing. And by the end of their discussion, while Ray was not willing to rule Kenneth out as a suspect, he was inclined to believe that Kenneth truly didn't know what had happened to Susan. And the polygraph that Kenneth willingly took proved to be inconclusive. So Detective Ray knew he had to keep looking for answers elsewhere, and that meant he would have to convince his superiors to give him the time and resources to go after other suspects. But not long after he met with Kenneth, Ray was preparing to make his case to his superiors that he needed more time and support when he got a call from Susan's sister. And when Ray asked her if everything was okay, she started laughing on the other line, and she said he could stop searching for Susan. Ray shook his head like he must have misunderstood her, and then he asked her what she meant. And Susan's sister told him that one of their cousins had gotten in touch to say she'd recently spoken to Susan on the phone, and so Susan must be okay. Ray really wanted to believe Susan was somewhere safe and sound, and that she had made that phone call, but he had to follow up on it to be sure. So he took down the name and address of this cousin, thanked Susan's sister for letting him know, and then he headed out of the station with the hope that he might actually find Susan. In mid-January, 7 months after Susan's disappearance, Detective Ray sped down a country road outside of Pikeville. And after driving for several miles, he turned onto a dirt road, and then a few minutes later, he arrived at a small trailer home. Ray parked his car and stepped out into the cool winter air. Then he walked through the overgrown grass towards the front of the trailer, and he saw the door was open. But before he could say anything, he heard a woman shout from inside, and he heard footsteps cutting across the trailer. And then the woman appeared in the doorway with the barrel of a shotgun pointed right at Ray. Ray put his hands up, introduced himself, and reassured the woman he was only there to help find her cousin Susan. The woman looked Ray over and then lowered the gun. Susan's cousin was 52 years old, but she looked way older than that to Ray. And even though she'd put her weapon down, she still stared at him like she didn't trust him. So in his very calm voice, Ray asked her about the phone conversation she'd had with Susan. But Susan's cousin suddenly had a strange look come over her face, like she was trying to remember something from a long, long time ago. And so Ray asked her if everything was okay, and she looked right at him and said she wasn't convinced anymore that the woman who had called her actually was Susan. She said she might have been on some prescription pills at the time that made her a little loopy and confused, and so maybe that's why she thought it was Susan when really it wasn't. And then she leaned in close to Ray and said that she thought someone might have been playing a prank on her. Ray smiled and thanked her for the help, then he turned and walked back to his car. The truth was, he had no idea what to make of this. He could easily believe this woman had mistaken another caller for her missing cousin, and he was sorry to admit it, but he also believed there were people in town who were cruel enough to play a prank like that on a lonely woman like her. So by the time Ray got back to the station, he was feeling desperate. It had taken months for him to get the okay to question Susan's ex-husband, and now his hope that Susan had contacted a family member had disappeared in one quick conversation with the cousin, and Ray knew he didn't have the support to just keep pursuing this case for as long as he wanted. But he was not willing to give up yet, and he still believed he could find Susan. So he went back to the one group he thought might be able to help him, the FBI. And finally, after months of his investigation, Ray had a face-to-face meeting with an FBI agent that would help shed new light on the case. And soon after that meeting, Detective Ray and members of the FBI would have a clear picture of what happened that night at the motel, and they would find Susan. Based on the information from Ray's face-to-face meeting with the FBI agent and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the night Susan disappeared, June 8, 1989. On June 8, 1989, at 10:30 p.m., the Ford Tempo pulled into the motel parking lot. The driver stepped out of the car and glanced up at the second floor. The driver saw Susan standing there in gray shorts and a t-shirt, but the driver just put their head down and tried to move fast enough so Susan would not see them. Then the driver headed into a room on the first floor, closed the door behind them, and sat down on the bed. But only a few minutes later, the driver heard someone pounding on the door. They knew it had to be Susan, so they took a deep breath, got up, and opened the door. And as soon as the door opened, Susan barged in and started screaming and yelling. The driver shut the door behind her and tried to calm Susan down, but she wasn't calming down. She just kept on yelling. The driver knew the motel walls were thin, and they didn't want to draw any attention to themselves, so they grabbed Susan by the hand, led her out of the room, into the parking lot, and over to their car, the Ford Tempo. They both got inside, Susan kept yelling, and the driver just immediately fired up the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and they made their way out onto a dark mountain road. But as they drove, Susan just continued to yell, and the driver struggled to concentrate on the narrow, winding road, so they eventually found a clearing to pull into, and they parked the car. But once the car was stopped, Susan just got louder and louder. She was angry, and she was saying things that didn't make any sense, and so the driver finally snapped at her and told her to be quiet, but she just kept going. The driver tried to interject and to make her listen, but Susan didn't want to hear anything they had to say. And soon, all of Susan's words started to blend together, and the driver could feel a sharp pain starting behind their eyes, and they really wanted Susan to just stop talking. So finally, the driver slammed their hands down on the dashboard and then lunged across the car at Susan. The driver wrapped their hands around Susan's throat and started squeezing as hard as they could. Susan thrashed her arms and tried to break free, but the driver squeezed Susan's throat even tighter. Then Susan kicked her feet wildly and she cracked the windshield with her shoe, but the driver did not let go. They tightened their grip and watched Susan's face turn red as she spit and gasped for air. And then finally, Susan's legs and arms went limp. The driver released their grip on Susan and her body slumped over in the passenger seat. Then the driver looked down at their hands and they were shaking, and they saw there was a cut on one of them, and they looked at Susan's body and the cracked windshield, and suddenly the car felt like it was spinning. So the driver took a breath and tried to keep themselves calm. Then the driver glanced outside to make sure no cars were on the nearby road. And when they were sure they were alone in this clearing, they got out of the car, went around to the passenger side, opened the door, and pulled Susan's body out onto the ground. Then the driver stripped Susan out of her shorts and shirt and carried the clothes around to the back of the car. They popped open the trunk, tossed the clothes in, and then went back to Susan's body. The driver crouched down, picked Susan up, and then threw her into the trunk as well. Then they got back into the car, pulled out onto the mountain road, and headed back towards the motel. At the motel, the driver showered, bandaged their cut hand, and stayed awake all night. Then, on the following morning, they drove to a meeting with Susan's body still in the trunk of their car, and later that night, they got rid of Susan's clothes in a trash can, and then they drove the Ford Tempo down a series of mountain roads that led past an old coal mine to a dense wooded ravine. There, the driver parked the car, went around to the trunk, pulled out Susan's body, and laid it down in the ravine beneath a pile of weeds and underbrush. Then the driver left the ravine, got back inside of their Ford Tempo, and headed back to the motel. And the following week, they flew to Miami and headed home to see their wife and kids before going into work at the offices of the FBI. FBI agent Mark Putnam, the man who had first recruited Susan as an informant, had strangled Susan to death and left her body in the middle of nowhere. It turned out Mark and Susan had been having a secret affair while she was working for him as an informant. But when Mark had left for Miami, Susan felt completely used and discarded, and when she tried to call Mark, he had pushed her away. But then, in June of 1989, Mark had to return to Pikeville to help wrap up a case he'd worked on while he was there. And it turned out the other FBI agent Susan had worked with knew about her and Mark's relationship. And so when Susan had reached out to that agent for help after Cat Eyes' girlfriend attacked her, she told the agent she was pregnant with Mark's child. And the agent believed Susan had the right to confront Mark about the baby, so he told her that Mark was coming back to town, and he booked her a room at the motel where Mark would be staying. So then, on the night of June 8th, wearing gray gym shorts and a t-shirt that belonged to Mark, Susan had waited for him to pull into the parking lot and go to his room. And when Mark went into his room, Susan followed him inside. And she said she was going to tell Mark's wife and his superiors at the FBI that he had slept with one of his informants and gotten her pregnant, and that's when Mark had pulled her out of the room and taken her to the car, and after they had parked in that clearing and continued to argue, Mark finally grabbed Susan and strangled her to death. It would turn out Detective Ray had actually suspected Mark from the beginning, but investigating an FBI agent for possible homicide was extremely difficult and complicated. But when Ray had finally gotten the FBI to set up an interview, Mark denied he had had an affair with Susan and said she had made the story up about her being pregnant, and he said he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Susan's claim that she was pregnant with Mark's child would never be confirmed, but that interview with Mark still led authorities to a piece of incriminating evidence. Mark had rented the Ford Tempo through the FBI when he went back to Pikeville, but he had returned the Tempo early and rented another car. And the rental car company had noted that the Tempo had a badly cracked windshield. And when Mark was confronted about the cracked windshield by investigators, he struggled to come up with a viable excuse for it. And after that, Mark panicked, and his version of events quickly started to fall apart, and he eventually admitted to having an affair with Susan, and then he confessed to killing her. It was the first time in history that an FBI agent would be convicted of murder. But Mark still had one move he could make that could save him from life in prison. He said in exchange for a more lenient sentence, he would tell Detective Ray, state police, and the FBI where he had left Susan's body. Mark signed a plea deal and gave law enforcement the location of Susan's body, and on June 5th, 1990, almost exactly a year after Mark had killed Susan, Susan's remains were located and retrieved. And soon after, Susan's family was able to bury her in a private funeral. As part of his deal, Mark pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But he was released from prison after serving only 10 years and 3 months. As of 2023, he was living in Georgia and working as a personal trainer. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.